I believe there is some over-transparency, some oversharing being popularized in the mainstream, and especially when it comes to artists, performers. On the one side, suffering and emotional pain should not be a taboo, like, oh, let's not talk about it ever, it doesn't exist. That kind of not talking about it is horrible. But on the other hand, of displaying too much in public is just not the right way. It satisfies usually only the voyeurism of other people. It usually does not help anyone really, especially not the person sharing that. In some instances, yes, the sharing of an experience can be gratifying in some way, yeah, sure. But with a public audience, I mean, if you share it with people you trust, sure, but with the public, I would just suggest to really carefully think about that. Now, the issue with carefully thinking about it is the thinking part. And that's going to be influenced by your personal boundaries of what you feel is adequate for you to share. And I know we're all adults here, so what we feel and what we say, that is, and that is what you want. All right, I get it. But there are just moments in life, and especially when we are still having unresolved emotional pain and trauma, where our perception of our limitations and boundaries of what we want to share and what not are changed. They are not as developed as they would be. Just have so much less of a filter. I don't know if you have encountered people who just came up to you and in the first meeting told you, oh my God, you know what, I've gone through this and that trauma. And you're like, whoa, okay, yeah. Maybe you reacted like that, or maybe you reacted like, okay, now let me tell you my trauma, right? And then you kind of met on the same level. And that results in sharing more than you would if you were not anymore in that vulnerable state. And me knowing both sides of that coin, even from my personal life, because I've been in that state of having very little filter, and yes, I could listen to everyone's trauma and I was very fascinated by that. I was still in a very traumatized state and age of my life. Now looking back at that, I'm like, I would just not do that anymore. Now there are people, artists, public figures, and they're making themselves vulnerable that way, that they share that and expose this. And then I'm always thinking like, it does give you so little back, right? And the public obviously doesn't always act responsibly. Some do, most don't. And then that also doesn't help your process. So long story short, what is it really good for to share that with anonymous people? It is a myth that sharing your trauma will make it automatically better. It usually doesn't. It is personal. It just is by nature. If you decide to share something very personal with other people, okay. But let's never forget it is something very personal. I think we can still be vulnerable while not suffering anymore at the same time. I think when we're still in pain, we deserve to be protected from more hurt and given time and opportunity to heal. And coming out of that, we will still be very empathetic, wiser than before, more emotionally mature, and then we can still produce vulnerability. I think people sometimes confuse vulnerability with someone still being in pain. That's not what being vulnerable is. It's not exactly the same. The things are related, but they're not the same.